malnutrition can be both an excess of nutrition or a decrease in nutrition. But for our discussion in this webinar, will pertain mostly to undernutrition. And overweight or obese, the NFLD, that is NASH patients with cirrhosis, is now around 10 to 15% of the patients in our population are having fatty liver. Almost 1/3 with diabetes patients have fatty liver. Most of them progress to have advanced fibrosis, and some of these patients have cirrhosis. So, on the first go, if we see the patients in our clinic as a dietitian, as a nutritionist, gastroenterologist, hepatologist, we are of the view, we are prejudiced that the patient is adequately nourished because the patient weight is normal. And if the patient doesn't have ascites, we are more so bound to feel that the patient is of normal weight, and the height weight ratio, that is BMI, is correct, and the patient is likely to be nourished, whereas this is not the fact. So in these patients, we may be overlooking sarcopenia. So these patients may actually be having sarcopenic obesity. So they have obesity, that is high fat mass, but a very malnourished, that is very under less than 2 standard deviations muscles which they require compared to their height. So they may be sarcopenic, their BMI may be normal, but they may have obesity. So obesity and BMI does not always tell us that the patient is adequately nourished. And malnutrition, obesity, and sarcopenic obesity worsens the progression of the cirrhosis. So these patients decompensate earlier. They have a lot of infections. They can have bleeding. They can have encephalopathy. And even if we post-transplant these patients, the outcome survival in these patients is poorer as compared to the patients who are not malnourished. And these factors are independent of the MELD score. The MELD score, which we calculate of the liver dysfunction based on the INR and creatinine, that's also independent of that. That is, nutrition is independently associated with a better prognosis and survival. Not all patients of cirrhosis have a option of transplant, maybe due to lack of donor, maybe due to advanced age. So in these patients, only thing which we can do apart from few drugs which are available is adequate nutrition, so that we delay the complications, although we can't prevent it. So what's the prevalence of malnutrition in cirrhotic patients? The prevalence of malnutrition in cirrhotic patients varies somewhere between 20 to 70%. So if the patient is compensated, that is, the patient doesn't have encephalopathy, doesn't have ascites, no water in tummy, the patient is not having jaundice, so these are compensated patients. So we may presume that the patient have only varices, the patient has normal BMI, and the patient has a normal nutrition status, whereas we will be wrong 20% of the time in this class of patients. Whereas once the decompensation starts, that is, if you have tummy fluid, if the patient starts having ascites, if the patient has had any episode of hepatic encephalopathy, maybe grade 1, grade 2. So in these patients, if we assess by a experienced dietitian, or even if the gastroenterologist himself assesses them, then 50% of the patients will be malnourished in this decompensated cirrhosis, which further advances with the CTP class we'll discuss in the next slides. And progression. So if the patient is adequately nourished at the beginning and the patient loses his muscles and becomes malnourished, there is a rapid progression to liver failure, and the transplant, which would have been done at the appropriate time, may be delayed after 4 or 5 years or maybe 10 years, has to be done beforehand. And even with the transplant, the outcome is worse. So this sort of patients, and malnutrition in the patient, compensated patient is walking about, we may not feel that the patient is malnourished. Whereas in decompensated patients, when the patient has ascites, they rapidly lose weight, and the focus of malnutrition confines to these class of patients, that is decompensated. Whereas we have to be alert in the compensated state to prevent decompensation of the patients. Again, there is a difference between the female patients and the male patients. So female patients have more fat. In cirrhosis, the depletion of fat is more in females, whereas men lose more of the muscles. So if you see men with cirrhosis, maybe with ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, you will see very thin muscles, the biceps, the triceps, the mid-arm circumference, mid-arm muscle circumference, everything will be very less. So it's only just skin and bones. So loss of muscle tissue is much more rapid in men, and what is the figures we'll see in the next slide. So this is the various studies which has been done in cirrhotic patients, and in all the studies, just see this not just malnutrition, it's sarcopenia. So what is the loss of muscles? So in the various studies, from minimum of 30% to around 40%, 45%, 68% to as far as 70%. So your patients, around 70% of your patients at the maximum can have sarcopenia when you diagnose them as cirrhotic. So in the OPD, if we don't assess and manage nutrition, maybe with help of a dietitian or ourselves, if we have time, then we may be missing a lot of patients. We may not be providing the adequate care which we should provide. So this is the sarcopenia, the differences between males and females. So if you look at my cursor, see this is the female group. The class, there are three child classes: CTP A, B, and C. So males and females. See, as the female progresses from class A to B to C, there is not a significant difference in the muscle mass. P value is more than 0.9. So 14%, 21%, and 23%. This is a study published in Liver Transplant in 2012 by Dr. Tandon et al. So no significant difference. Whereas just see the marked and striking difference in males. So if a male person is cirrhotic, see, initially to begin with, even if they may not be sarcopenic, they may have just NASH-related cirrhosis. Once they progress to CTP, around 42% of the patients, and in CTP, just see the difference to 70. So 2/3 of the patients in child C patients is malnourished and it's sarcopenic. So they have lost all the muscles, which again portends that they may have a higher incidence of infections, encephalopathy, and post-transplant poor complications. So we are not just confining to the present scenario. The post-transplant complications also is markedly different, more so for males with cirrhosis. So once you see a cirrhotic patients with ascites or maybe an encephalopathy or jaundice in your OPD, so these are type C patients, and consider that almost 2/3 of the patients are malnourished. Please take care of their nutrition. If we can't assess, if we don't have time, please send to a dietitian for an expert opinion. So sarcopenia and cirrhosis is the most common complication. You may have heard of bleeding, jaundice, ascites as the complications, but sarcopenia is the most common complication associated with cirrhosis, because it begins even when the patient is not compensated, even when the patient is compensated. So this is the first complication to start with. The patient not only has a loss in muscle mass, the patient also loses muscle strength. So it's not just the muscle mass. What you see is just the tip of iceberg. The patient also has a loss in strength. By the loss in strength, what do we mean? That the functional capacity of the muscle fibers is decreased. And this makes the patient more vulnerable in terms of his cognitive skills, in terms of his functions, and the term used for this is frailty. So the patient is frail. Our patient is frail. And how do we assess frailty? How can a nutritionist or a doctor can assess frailty? So if the patient complains of excessive loss of muscles, excessive loss of weight, that is unintentional weight loss. If the patient complains of exhaustion, that the patient says that I get tired very easily, fatigue. So there is a sense of exhausted. Patient gets exhausted very easily. You can go for a 13-feet walk test. You can ask the patient to walk for 13 feet. You can ask the patient to walk for 400 meters, which takes a certain amount of time. That is a 6-minute walk test. You can ask the patient to rapidly get up from chair and sit down. So these, and you can also go for anthropoetic measurements. So if you ask the muscles to work, so that says that tells you the functionality of the muscle. If the patient cannot do all this work rapidly, if you see the patient walks into the OPD, if the patient is walking to a chair very slowly, this again says the patient is frail. The patient may have a normal muscle mass, but the patient is frail. That is, the muscles are not working properly. Yes, ammonia has a role, a high ammonia has a role, but this is independent of hepatic encephalopathy. So if the muscles are not functioning properly, a high ammonia baseline apnea patient may not have altered sensorium, but functional capacity, the mechanisms are not yet known, but the contractile function of the muscles is altered. And the sarcopenia also affects the survival of the patient. So once the patient is sarcopenic, the survival is significantly decreased. Because of frailty, the patient cannot walk, is exhausted all the time, is losing weight, Even getting up from chair is difficult. So the quality of life of the patient is decreased. They cannot function properly, and the patient is confined mostly to the house or the place of work. So quality of life of the patient is also related to sarcopenia. Also, development of other complications of cirrhosis, mainly hepatic encephalopathy. So ammonia is detoxified in the muscles. So when there is no muscle, there is no detoxification of ammonia, patient will have higher incidence of encephalopathy. So very important reason that we have to build up muscles by maybe supplements, some powder supplements, branch in amino acids, high protein intake. So these are the things which will help in the building of the muscles. Also, independently, sarcopenia is associated with poorer survival after liver transplantation. So all this has been taken from various good journals, Hepatology, American Journal of Gastroenterology. So to sum up, sarcopenia significantly affects our patients and we need to address it with a good nutrition. So how does what's the incidence of hepatic encephalopathy and sarcopenia? So these are the 4 studies which have seen in patients incidence of hepatic encephalopathy, that is altered sensorium in patients with malnutrition and without malnutrition. So in this study, hepatic encephalopathy was seen in 46% of the patients with malnutrition versus only 27% of the patients without malnutrition. So significant difference, almost double. Again, in this study, hepatic encephalopathy by Huseman et al. Was seen in 29% with malnutrition versus without malnutrition, they didn't see any incidence of hepatic encephalopathy. Maybe their patients were all child age status. Again, in the study by Meza Junko et al., hepatic encephalopathy was seen in 23% of the patients versus only 12% of the patients who are without sarcopenia. The study in 2013 by Murley et al. With 300 patients were the most significant, in which they studied 2 kinds of encephalopathy. Overt encephalopathy, that is, you can visibly see the patient is encephalopathy. Minimal encephalopathy means you can define encephalopathy, you can find out only with special tests. So minimal hepatic encephalopathy was present in around 50% versus only 30% of the patient without sarcopenia. And overt hepatoencephalopathy was seen in 30 versus just half, that is only 15% of the patient with sarcopenia. So here it is half, here it is half. So almost, if there is sarcopenia, almost the incidence of encephalopathy almost doubles. So this is a general assumption which we can make. In various studies, it's almost double the encephalopathy rate if the hepatic encephalopathy. Once the patient has encephalopathy, once they have altered sensorium, what can happen? Patient can have frequent falls. Now the INR is more, coagulopathy is there, platelets are less, and generally these are of advanced age, 40 years or 60 years of age, and there can be a lot of fragility fractures. That is, a very small trauma can cause fracture of their bones with their underlying osteoporosis and hepatic encephalopathy related falls. So addressing hepatic encephalopathy by sarcopenia by way of nutrition is very important. So this is a study in which 62 patients were included, and the duration of study was 14 days. So once hepatic encephalopathy is there, many patients, many doctors, and sometimes dietitians are of the view that the protein should be restricted because protein generates ammonia. So let's see this study. It's a very good study in which 30 patients were randomized to 2 groups. So one group, normal protein was fed, that is 1.2 grams per kg per day from day 1 to day 14. These are the patients with episodic hepatic encephalopathy. So these are hepatic encephalopathy patients who have various episodes with intermittent episodes of normalcy. So protein intake normal was given 1.2, no difference. So another group, what was given? Low protein. That is, on first 3 days, absolutely no protein was given. And protein was increased on day 12, day 20 to 12 grams, 24 grams, and 48 grams every 3 days, and 1.2 gram per kg for the last 2 days. That is day 13 and day 14. See, this is what is the results. So normal protein, this dark one is the normal protein diet, and the white one is the low protein diet. So day 0, day 7, day 14. This is a 14-day study. So you can see the stage of hepatic encephalopathy. It's same. So what was inferred is no difference in the course of hepatic encephalopathy was seen between the low protein group and the normal protein group. So we don't have to restrict protein in case of hepatic encephalopathy. They also saw the serum ammonia levels. the albumin levels, the bilirubin levels, and the coagulopathy profiles, and they were comparable in both groups. So even there was no increase in ammonia even with the use of normal proteins. So normal protein diet is safe and it doesn't exacerbate hepatic encephalopathy. This was published in 2004. The study was by Cordoba et al. Now again, okay, so what is the implication? So once the patient has sarcopenia, or once the patient has malnourishment, so what's the indication? It's a vicious cycle. See, just see this cycle. The patient has malnutrition and simultaneously patient can have sarcopenia. Malnutrition patient can have vitamin D deficiency, mineral deficiency, selenium deficiency associated with increased fibrosis in hepatitis C, and higher encephalopathy is seen branch change. So multiple microminerals, manganese excess can be seen, and so malnutrition is present along with the sarcopenia can be present. So if these two are present, hepatic encephalopathy, incidence of infections, recurrent ascites is more in this class of patients, and which leads to decompensation. Once the patient is decompensated due to various reasons which we will discuss later on, malnutrition is present, sarcopenia is present. So this cycle continues, and we have to break this cycle with provision of adequate nutrition. So if we break this cycle, what will happen? Decompensation will be prevented, encephalopathy will be prevented, ascites will be prevented, bacterial infection will be prevented. But if sarcopenia and malnutrition continues, this will happen, decompensate further decompensated, that is patient is encephalopathy, due to ascites patient will have decreased intake. So again they will have further increase in hepatic complications, and this overall will lead to a reduced overall survival. This was again a study by Dr. Tandon et al. And even in HCC there is increased, what they had studied, the patient group which was studied was in HCC there was increased complications and reduced survival. In post-surgery patients also there was reduced survival. And even in post-transplant, the waiting list, if the patient is waiting for a transplant and we don't manage the nutrition, there will be an increase in waiting list mortality. Along with a post-operative, even if they go for a transplant, the post-transplant also they have a higher mortality. So even if your patient is waiting for a transplant, you have to manage their nutrition to break the cycle, and so that the patient has a good post-transplant period and patient can survive the waiting list. If the patient dies in the waiting list for transplant, it's of no use. So why does our patient doesn't eat? Why doesn't the patient eat? What are the factors which lead to metabolism or metabolic alterations and malnutrition in cirrhotic patients? So there are two groups. So there is reduced intake and there is increased catabolism. So reduced intake and increased catabolism. And why is there a reduced intake? See, there is portal hypertension, there is a lot of congestion in the gut, so there is an anorexia. And when the liver is bad, there is anorexia along with jaundice, there is gastroparesis, and small intestinal motility disorders are there to portal hypertension. Ascites, if there is a lot of fluid in the tummy, the capacity of stomach decreases and you have an early sense of fullness. So the patient eats little, the patient feels full all the time. Portal hypertension again leads to congestion and there is decreased absorption. So there is an impaired mucosal absorption of food, and the patient may be going for various procedures, maybe sometimes CT scan, endoscopy banding, and repeated banding, ascitic tap. The patient may have encephalopathy and patient is in hospital. And these are the times when patient goes for complete starvation. And we'll see the role of starvation and the adverse effect which it plays in our patients. So this starvation is detrimental to the patient. There is change in taste. Also, sometimes we restrict the diet of the salt of the patient. So if you restrict the salt, the less than 60 millimoles per day restriction leads to very unpalatable diets, which the patient cannot take. So we have to restrict the salt, but not at the cost of sarcopenia and malnutrition. So the patient says that patient cannot take food without salt. You have to rethink, and we have to redefine the diet plan of the patient, so that patient takes adequate calories, adequate protein, minerals, and vitamins, and not just, salt cannot be just the sole detrimental factor for our diet plan. Also, Along with all this decrease, there is an increased catabolism in the patient because the patient is hypermetabolic. The resting energy expenditure is more. Infection, sepsis, cirrhotic patients have immunodeficiency, recurrent sepsis occurs in the patient. There is also a baseline level of endotoxemia. So the the mucosal barrier is defective. There is a lot of translocation of bacteria and low level of endotoxemia is always there. GI bleeding again leads to loss of blood and lot of protein is lost. Protein synthesis response is decreased. There is insulin resistance if the patient is diabetic and fatty liver related cirrhosis. Hormone deficiency is there. The signaling of skeletal muscle is decreased. There is decrease in androgen. So there is a lesser drive for formation of muscles. Also, there is something called the metabolic switch. The primary fuel for the muscles in this scenario is not glucose but fatty acids. So again, there is a fatty acids in the aromatic branching amino acids are not being utilized because they are primarily the source of fuel in the liver, and in presence of portal hypertension, very less blood goes to the liver. Also, because liver cirrhosis there is hepatocellular dysfunction. These cells cannot metabolize aromatic amino acids. So the aromatic amino acids increase in the blood. And the primary source of fuel in the alpha ketoglutarate and high ammonia branch-in amino acids being used, and the branch-in amino acid levels fall in the blood. So the ratio of branch-in amino acids to aromatic amino acids in the blood is altered, and this is exactly the reason why branch-in amino acids help us in the recovery with encephalopathy and build-up of muscles. So this is why the branch-in amino acids and aromatic amino acids are not being used. So this is a slide in which we are showing cirrhosis and the patient having malnutrition, patient has portal hypertension, patient has sarcopenia and impaired ammonia clearance. So what does, till now we have seen the role of malnutrition. The patient is cirrhotic, has portal hypertension, sarcopenia, a part and parcel of malnutrition, and increased ammonia metabolism and decreased clearance due to liver cirrhosis. All this lead to hepatic decompensation. This is just the malnutrition plant. I am not talking of cirrhosis and high MELD scores. So malnutrition related hepatic decompensation. What happens with decompensation and malnutrition? There is a reduced functional capacity of the muscles. There is a decreased cognitive functions of the muscles. So all these patients have made our patient frail. That is, the patient cannot work, they cannot work like a normal human being, they feel exhausted all the time, they cannot carry out their daily activities with that much ease, they want to remain confined to bed or chair, and there is a lack of mobility or decreased mobility. So hepatic decompensation, they can lead to falls and fractures. There increased complications, decompensations may be due to ascites, encephalopathy, bleeding will lead to increased hospitalizations, and all this will lead to limited recovery, disability, and death. So these are the patients which we can intervene, especially during the waiting period for transplant, when we don't want our patient to die before they get a liver, either cadaveric or a live donor. We want them to pass this phase smoothly. So we don't want our patient to become frail. So the point of intervention will be this, and not this once the patient has decompensated, once the patient has fractured, when the patient is hospitalized for HE. So the time on, so skeletal muscles proteolysis starts to meet the energies, and the branch-in amino acids decrease. Also, there is systemic inflammation. So there is again muscle breakdown. The due to alcohol related or even otherwise in cirrhotics, testosterone levels are low. So hypogonadism leads to increased skeletal muscle myostatin. Again, that leads to myostatin is a primary driving factor for sarcopenia. Also, there is reduced clearance of ammonia because liver is not working, and other toxic metabolites lead to elevated ammonia levels because there is decreased clearance of ammonia in the liver. So increased ammonia again decreases both the mass and the function of the liver. So there is sarcopenia and there is decreased muscle function. Again, portal hypertension and gastropathy makes the patient nauseated all the time. So these are the reasons why patient didn't eat. When the patient didn't eat, why does the muscle break? And also physical inactivity contributes to sarcopenia as a confounding factor. So what should we do? How should we screen the patients? So once we see a patient in our hospital or in OPD, we should go for a rapid nutrition screen. Two patients just by looking at the BMI, if the BMI of the patient is less than 18.5 or the patient is child C, you can take for granted that the patient is malnourished and this patient doesn't require screening. We have to straight away start malnutrition treatment and correction of malnutrition for this class of patients. For everybody else, that is BMI more than 18.5 and child A and B, we have to assess the patient. We'll come to that in next slide. And all patients, cirrhotics, all patients are at risk of malnutrition that we have to assess, and they should be reviewed by a registered dietitian or a nutritionist expert. So this is how, once the patient has cirrhosis, so this is a very simple slide. So once the patient has cirrhosis, whether you are a dietitian, you are a gastroenterologist, just see the child score of the patient. If the patient is child C, the patient is at high risk of malnutrition, just follow my cursor. High risk of malnutrition, assess for sarcopenia. How do we assess for sarcopenia? CT scan. Now CT scan sees at the level of L3 vertebra the various muscles, that is psoas muscle and paraspinal muscles, the muscles which are around the spine. So paraspinal muscles and the psoas muscles are seen in CT scan. CT scan, everybody will say that is difficult. How can you do CT scan again and again? But 99% of the patient, or maybe 100% of the patients, have undergone CT scan at least at one part of their time, and also maybe every 2 years for assessment of liver disease, presence of HCC, portal vein thrombus, various reasons why they undergo CT scan. So they require just a software. You can see the muscle value. Moreover, this muscle value is not altered by the ascitic fluid. So even if you have ascites, this muscle parameter gives you the exact value if the patient is sarcopenic or not. Also, you can go for a whole body DEXA scan. Impedance may not be available everywhere, but DEXA scan whole body is available. So child C, patient high risk, you have to assess. Sarcopenia, you have to correct. If the patient is child A or B, assess whether the patient has fluid in his tummy and estimate the dry weight. So child A or B, calculate the BMI. If the BMI is less than 18.5, patient at high risk, you follow this protocol, CT scan, DEXA, and correction. If the BMI is more than 30, the patient is obese. For everybody else, that is BMI of 18.5 to around 30, 29.9. Screen the patient for malnutrition. Utilize various nutrition tools like mid-arm circumference, we'll see in the next slide, and assess the lifestyle, detailed assessment. What you can do for nutrition assessment is ideally one should do a 3-day recall, but that may be cumbersome and patient may alter the diet during the recall period. So 24 hours recall, or maybe just a simple question to the patient whether their diet has decreased, whether their weight has decreased, whether and by how much has the diet decreased, 50%, 40%. This is a simple nutritional tool in OPD at least we can do if we are not a qualified nutritionist. So based on this, we will in the global assessment, we'll tell the patient is high risk, medium risk, or low risk. If the patient is low risk, we'll follow up the patient with similar test after 1 year. If the patient is on medium risk, we have to go for the global assessment and reported dietary intake, that is 24 hours recall or a 3-day recall. And again, if the patient is sarcopenia, malnutrition gets corrected, we'll follow the protocol. We rescreen after 1 year. If the patient is at high risk, we'll rescreen in 3 to 6 months. So child C, sarcopenia assessment, BMI less than 18, whatever be the CTP score, high risk. For 18.5 to 29.9, categorize your patient into high risk, medium risk, low risk. Low risk, follow up in 1 year. For high risk, medium risk, correct the sarcopenia, follow up again after 1 year. In high risk patients, follow up after 6 months. So this is how we should follow our patients. And what are the anthropometric tools available? BMI, of course, it is fallacious in our patients. Mid-arm muscle circumference, that is, you calculate the mid-arm circumference, and from that, if you subtract tricep skin fold, that multiplied by 0.314, so that will give you the not mid-arm circumference but mid-arm muscle circumference. So tricep skin fold also correlates and is a very good reflective of your CT scan related muscle mass. Mid-arm muscle circumference also correlates with the CT scan mid-arm muscle circumference, but mid-arm muscle circumference only and not tricep skin fold has been shown to correlate with mortality in cirrhotic patients, and that too also mainly in males, because you have seen the difference between males and females. males are losing more muscles, so muscle assessment is more important in males. So the best test which I would classify among this is mid-arm muscle circumference. Although if you don't have time, triceps skin fold thickness is good enough. And also hand grip is a quick assessment tool. Sarcopenia, if the grip is less than 2 standard deviations, we can go for the creatinine height index, which you can calculate. Again, this is I don't think everybody will like to do this. 24 hours urine creatinine would calculate that divided by into 100 divided by normal 24-hour creatinine. So again, that will classify your patient into mild, moderate, and severe depletion. 15 to 30% is moderate, more than 30% is severe depletion, 5 to 10% is mild depletion. So not a costly test, but 24 hours urine collection is required. Hand grip, I think, is again a quick method of assessment. It is seen to correlate with sarcopenia and prognosis in patients, but no trials are available to see the effect of hand grip strength as the robust data is seen with mid-arm muscle circumference. So till now, if you talk of evidence, mid-arm muscle circumference still the best, although with calipers, triceps, skin fold is good enough. In OPD, hand grip strength assessment and less than 2 standard deviation can define your sarcopenia. When we find this, patient goes for a subjective global assessment, qualify, adequately nourished, mild malnourished, or severe malnutrition present, and then follow up your patient. So what should be the diet plan for the patient? So patients should eat a variety of foods, not just eat fruits and vegetables should always be included. The calorie intake should be adequate for the patients. So, and it's very important to maintain the calories rather than be advising them on particular types of food or a chart of food. So, if what should be the calories? If you want to maintain the if the patient is normal, has normal muscle mass, has normal is not sarcopenic, around 30 kilocalories per day and 1.2 kilocalories, 1.2 grams per kg of protein per day is good enough to maintain the nutrition. But if your patient is sarcopenic, the nutrition requirement changes. It is around 35 kilocalories per day and 1.5 grams per kg per day of proteins. That is to reverse the sarcopenia. But you may get sometimes patients who have sarcopenic obesity, so they have already a lot of calories. So in these patients, the calorie intake will be decreased. That is around 25 kilocalories per kg per day, and will increase the protein to increase the metabolism. So protein requirement will be 2 grams per kg per day. And if the patient is very much obese, you can restrict the calories maybe to 500 or even 800 kilocalories per day. So that's too less, but around 800 kilocalories per day you can restrict. The protein remains 2 grams per kg per day if we in sarcopenic obesity. So different diet plans we have to formulate for different patients, but taste of the patient has to be kept in mind. Now, what should the meal? How should we divide the meals? So the meals should be split into 3 main meals and 3 snacks. So late evening snack is the most important because that is the most prolonged hour of fasting. The patient takes dinner and then the patient takes breakfast. So 12 hours fasting patient is too detrimental for the patient. So 3 main meals, that is breakfast, lunch, dinner. Apart from that, patient should have 3 morning snack, mid-afternoon and late evening snack. And late evening snack is most important if the daily routine of the patient doesn't allow us to give a mid-morning, mid-afternoon, at least a late evening snack so that the calories and the proteins overnight is provided to the patient. Late evening snack is very, very important. So this is why does the patient failure to respond. So we give the patient drugs, we give the patient food. We have also improved the pathophysiology. We have given adequate protein, but still patient doesn't respond. Why? So just have a look. So this is the photosystemic stunting and the hepatocellular dysfunction. So there is a high shunt. Because the food assimilation doesn't go to liver, and all cirrhotic patients, the cirrhosis is a state of accelerated starvation. So once you see a cirrhotic patient, the patient is already starving. The patient is not fed. Even if your BMI is normal, the patient is not fed. Patient is starving because the muscles are breaking. So amino acid is decreasing and proteins, there is a proteolysis, proteins breaking. Increased ammonia, again myostatin activation, endotoxins from the gut, again proteins are protostasis occurs. mitochondrial dysfunction is there, decreased testosterone, decreased growth hormones. All this leads to decreased protein and a decreased muscle mass. Moreover, muscle contraction function is decreased. So that's why the proteins further decreases due to immobility, due to deconditioning. The patient further loses muscles. So even if we feed the patient, there are so many barriers for the patient to achieve adequate nutrition, and we have to overcome them all. So how do we overcome? For accelerated starvation, we provide supplemental calories, we provide them proteins and amino acids. Although there is no evidence to suggest that immunonutrition, that is diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids, will improve, although some had argued that omega-3 fatty acids may in fact cause problem to the patients. But still, supplemental calories and immunonutrition might help. For amino acids and protein breakdown, see, branch in amino acids, we can supplement to increase the muscle mass of the patient, to improve the encephalopathy of the patient. And for muscle contraction and muscle decrease, the patient has to go for a structured exercise program, whether endurance exercise is better, whether resistance exercise is better. See, endurance exercises, they may not increase the muscle mass. Resistance exercises will increase the muscle mass. Endurance exercise will increase the functionality of the muscles. Both are important. So the structured exercise program, why? The patient should not go for only one exercise. It should be a combination of both endurance exercise and resistance exercise, so that the muscle functionality is also intact, and also there is an increase in muscle mass of the patient. So exercise is very important in these patients. And this is why branching amino acid fares is the most important nutrition component. See, the exact mechanism how it acts is L-leucine and direct activation of mTOR. So rapamycin receptor is directly activated, and it provides glutamine for ammonia. It acts as an ammonia scavenger, combines with ammonia and is excreted. Also, not only leucine, also isoleucine and valine, they are compartmentalized in the mitochondria with acetyl-CoA enzyme. They can lead to formation of glutamate, and ammonia is scavenged. So this is how, if your patient is sarcopenic, if the patient is malnourished and patient is having hepatoencephalopathy, the best amino acids, the best nutrition form should include a branch in amino acids, that is L-leucine, isoleucine and valine. So this will increase the muscle mass of the patient and also decrease the encephalopathy of the patient. So, and how does exercise? There is a very small study, but very good study of exercise in cirrhosis. The sample size was small, around 17. So majority of the patients were child-age cirrhotics. So duration was of around 16 weeks. It was a supervised cycle. So there was a cycle which they had to run around 3 times per week. They had to come. So in this, what they saw after 16 weeks in the patients who exercised, there was increase in respiratory quotient. The 6-minute walk, that is, they have to walk 400 meters in 6 minutes. There is a small simple test to see the muscle functions, the muscle mass of the patient, the quality of life, and also HCPG. That is, we go from the hepatic veins, we measure the liver pressure, which ultimately determines how much high is the portal pressure. So they determined everything and saw there was a decrease in portal pressure, with what we are doing with decrease in weight and increase in with beta blockers. So there is decrease in HVPG, increase in muscle mass, the quality of life improved, and the 6-minute walk test improved, respiratory quotient also improved with exercise. So this was a study by Janet et al. Also, the newer agents which are being studied is testosterone supplementation. So this was around 101 patients were included in this study, and testosterone supplementation was given to these patients to increase the muscle mass, because they are a major determinant of outcome. So what they saw in the lean mass, in the testosterone group, you see the increase. It is plus 3.4, whereas in the placebo group, it was just, it didn't increase, it actually decreased, minus 0.7. So there was a significant increase with the use of testosterone in the muscle mass. Whether this is going to become a rule of the day, we don't know, but trials are still ongoing. This is just a 2016 study which was published in JHAP. But let's see. But likely testosterone will figure out well. The only problem with testosterone is increased incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma, that is liver cancer, with the use of testosterone therapy. This is the use of micronutrients and vitamins which are deficient. So the very good study, multiple investigators Crawford, Fisher, Chen, and Pius in various stages. This is child A, child B, child C. So just see the amount of vitamin D in the blood. So if the patient is child A, around it is 20 to 25. So around 20, insufficiency range. And if it is child B, it is around 15. And most of the patient in child C has vitamin D less than 10. So almost 100% of the patients in child C cirrhosis has vitamin D deficiency and requires a supplementation. So, and what should be the nutrition for hepatic encephalopathy? Nutrition, status of the patient, sarcopenia should be evaluated. We should avoid protein restriction. We already discussed why vegetables and dairy products are better tolerated as compared to non-vegetarian and animal proteins. Branch in amino acid supplementation should be given to improve neuropsychiatric function and to provide a positive nitrogen balance for the patient. And oral dietary intake should always be preferred. TP and parenteral nutrition should be reserved for patient who cannot take, who has undergone surgery. Whereas in patient with type encephalopathy grade 4, patient undergoing bandings, patient having bleeds, nasogastric or parenteral feeding should be continued and patient should not be starved. So, and what's the role of bone disease? Around 30% of the patients, cirrhotic patients, and 30% of the patients eligible for liver transplant have osteoporosis. Almost 1/3 of our patients of cirrhosis have osteoporosis. So loss of bone mass along with muscle mass. So it's not just muscles, it's deep within bones also. This also cause fragility fractures. And what are the risk factors for fractures and osteoporosis? Hypogonadism, alcohol, smoking, a low BMI, early menopause in females, family history of osteoporotic fractures, corticosteroids if the patient has autoimmune liver disease, or as a PSC associated, IBD, something patient may have a requirement of corticosteroids, or even for other reasons, advanced stage itself leads to osteoporosis and secondary amenorrhea more than 6 months. So this is the last slide, how we should manage the bone disease. So at the diagnosis, how do we make the diagnosis of bone disease? By a DEXA scan, 2-point DEXA scan, lumbar, spine and hip. Lateral x-rays can be done to see the fractures in the spine, fragility fractures, and lab measurement of calcium and vitamin D. So if the T-score is more than 1.5, the T-score can be in the osteopenic range or osteoporosis. So if the patient is osteoporotic, treatment should be bisphosphonates plus the new agents. In osteopenia, we can use bisphosphonates and the calcium and vitamin D. In normal range, we should supplement calcium and vitamin based on CTP status and the laboratory measurements of calcium and vitamin. So around 1000 to 1500 milligram of calcium should be supplemented daily, and the vitamin D around 800 units per day should be supplemented. So 50,000 formulations which are available in the market are better and not the 60,000 ones. So this is the last slide. Thank you.
So much, sir. In fact, sir, you've covered everything about the cirrhosis, right from the diagnosis, assessment, and then talking about the nutrition intervention. Participants, if you have any questions, I request you to please type in the chat box. So there's a question. So what about the fat intake in these patients? How should it be?
Yeah. See the fat intake. See primary fuel for liver. There I told about the muscle switch. There's a metabolic switch. The primary fuel is fatty acids for these patients. So if the patient is already having diabetes and other risk factors, is sarcopenic. In sarcopenic obesity, we don't need to restrict. We need to restrict the fatty acids. But if the patient is already sarcopenic, the patient already has low BMI, the patient doesn't have a fatty. So in these patients, I think fat intake should not be restricted. We should always monitor the fat. Fat itself is not going to define everything, because fat is a primary source of fuel, fat and protein for the patient and not glucose. But I think you should monitor the lipid profile. If there are no cardiac risk factors, you see the LDL levels. I think fat restriction should not be too rigid as we do. Protein, of course, should not be restricted, but there are no trials to substantiate how much fat should be given. I don't have an answer for that, but of course, I don't restrict fat in these kind of patients.
Right, sir. So how about patients with steatorrhea?
Steatorrhea. See, but cirrhosis patients don't have steatorrhea. If there is associated pancreatic disease, then you have to give the pancreatic enzymes. cirrhosis per se will not lead to steatorrhea. Steatorrhea will happen like if likely somebody who has asked the question who is talking about the obstructive jaundice. So if there is a PSC, then in PSC there is obstruction and steatorrhea. In them you have to routinely decrease the fat, or you can provide the semi-digested MCT based diet. So this kind of things you can give. But per se in liver cirrhosis, steatorrhea is not a prominent feature, because prominent problem is not with pancreas, it's with liver. So steatorrhea is not mainly seen. The deficiency of vitamins which are normally seen is B6, B12, and that is why the role of multivitamins. So it's not that the patient is always deficient in vitamin E. Yes, PSC patients, there is a in PSC patient with cirrhosis, there is a standard protocol, how much of vitamin A you have to replace, how much of vitamin E. So that is a separate group of patients that cannot be applied to all the patients. In PSC cirrhosis, you have to give all vitamin solution, all vitamin which are soluble in fat, these you have to replace, but not for all cirrhotics. But yes, vitamin A deficiency is seen in quite significant number of patients in child C cirrhosis. But these are all individualized. You can assess vitamin A, you can check vitamin E, then give. Because toxicity again will lead to altered sensorium, raised intracranial tension, raised intracranial pressure again, which can lead to altered sensorium. These patients are already having altered sensorium. So benign intracranial hypertension is the complication of hypervitaminous C, which can happen. I don't think all patients with vitamin A and fat soluble vitamins. Of course, you can go for a check for vitamin A, then you can replenish.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Next question we have: how do we start nutritional supplements in patients with fatty liver, and for how long should they be continued?
See, there are two things. Are we discussing? See, this is about chronic liver disease. So this is not a fatty liver patient. This is a cirrhotic patient. Because fatty liver patient, see, there are two. It's just a spectrum. You know, the person who is asked question is not wrong. Fatty liver is a spectrum. You know, it starts with fatty liver, goes on to NASH, fibrosis, and there's cirrhosis. Again, cirrhosis will be without varices or with varices. So it's all a spectrum, and we have not defined it. But yes, fatty liver, what you can go for as a nutritionist, you can go for a body composition analysis, which will exactly tell you how much is the fat, how much is the muscle mass. And maybe you can go for a lipid profile, then you can exactly assess how much is the fat. Like, you know, a person may have an athlete will have a very high body weight, but it's just muscles. So you don't need to restrict fat for that patient. Also, the fatty liver is alcoholic fatty liver, or it's the obesity related fatty liver. It's a Wilson disease fatty liver. So we don't know. So in Wilson's, we don't restrict fat. Alcoholic, we don't restrict fat. So if fatty liver is per se due to your diabetes or liver or blood fat related, then you are going to restrict fat for these patients. Otherwise, you go for the body composition analysis, see how much is the fat, see how much is the proteins, and then define a fat loss program. So most of us, what we advise in my prescription, I've stopped writing fat weight loss. What I prescribe is fat loss. So I don't prescribe no more for my fatty liver patient of weight loss, because they don't want to lose the weight. Because if I tell them to lose weight, what is severe calorie restriction, they stop all meals and they become, very thin and malnourished. So I don't want that to happen for my patient. I want to lose just fat in them, and they should decrease their fat intake. If you go for lipid profile, if there's a lot of fat, you have to decrease the fat in these patients. These are fatty liver patients, not cirrhotic patients. Yes.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir. In fact, there was another question on how to manage obese fatty liver patients. Sir has already answered this, that you have to go for the
thing is, it's very simple. You need just a very simple application, maybe a mobile or Google app. It can help you in this. It's very simple to manage these patients. The patient, you yourself are telling the answer as fatty liver. So fatty liver means you have to avoid fat. Then you have to see what's the cause of fat, whether the patient is eating more, or the body metabolism is such that it makes more fat from the carbohydrates itself, which she takes. So in that case, we have to restrict the carbohydrates also. And how much should we restrict? See, normally it's less than 1200 kilocalories per day diet is non-physiological. Nah? We should avoid giving this diet less than 1200. But sometimes, you provide very much low calorie diet, maybe 1000 kilocalorie, 800 kilocalories. But you have to keep in mind, this is not cirrhotic patient. This is obese patients who want to carry out their normal routine duty in office, or maybe their business. They want to carry out their business. They don't want to lose this fat at the cost of their livelihood. So we have to comply with all these things. Yes.
Right, sir. So there's another question. One of the patient is suffering from cirrhosis and high creatinine level, malnourished. So how do you manage the protein, and what type of protein to give?
Yeah, here comes the role of branched-chain amino acids. So protein, if the creatinine is high, how much is the high? Whether the patient is on dialysis, if the patient goes on to dialysis, whatever you do with the kidney doesn't affect you, because the kidney is just in position, but it's not functioning. So whether do you contrast study in the patient, you provide high protein diet, you provide low protein diet, only what you have to measure is just the electrolytes of the patient, and kidneys you can forego. But if the creatinine is increasing and the patient is not on dialysis, then you can't go for indiscriminate protein use. I think 0.8 grams per day per kg per day is the defined limit, which even the nephrologist would agree. If below this level, it's not good to give lower amount of protein, because that will worsen the sarcopenia. More protein will be toxic to the kidneys. I think 0.8 grams per kg per day.
Right, sir. So, sir, another question. What is your opinion about use of hydrolyzed whey protein supplementation in cirrhotic sarcopenic patients?
See, sarcopenic whey protein, again, we can use any protein, but the best protein which is there for liver is the branched-chain amino acids. So if your supplement has branched-chain, see, the protein for different patients is different. Whey protein definitely has a role, semi-digested, easily assimilated. Our patient cirrhotic already has a decreased assimilation. So this is definitely, any protein is going to help. I don't want to classify that whey protein is going to be better than this, because there is no data to substantiate. All my slides is substantiated by data. It's always a controlled trial proven, whatever I have said till now. So for whey protein related, even for branched-chain amino acids, it's said that you may supplement branched-chain amino acids. There will be an improvement in encephalopathy, there will be improvement in muscle mass, but till now there is no improvement in mortality. So there is no mortality benefit of adding branched-chain amino acids. Also, branched-chain amino acids are super costly. So cost is also an issue in India. So it depends. You can't restrict anybody to take whey protein. And in the second last slide, which I had told you, the food should be varied. Please don't restrict your patients to particular food. The only what we want from you is 1.2 grams per kg for maintenance, 1.5 gram per kg for build up of the muscles. The quality of food should be dairy based and vegetables which are better assimilated compared to non-veg or animal proteins. So, but we cannot define that it's just the whey protein which is going to help, or which. If you want to specifically ask amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine, branched-chain amino acids. If you want to specify the food, then it will be omega-3 fatty acids and arginine, which are the immunonutrition components. So if any food, any protein has all these proteins, I'll prefer this food over any other protein. So whey protein may be good for a person who goes to a gym, a normal human being, and I don't know if there is any data to substantiate on whey protein for cirrhosis. No, there is none.
So participants, any further questions?
Yeah, Gunjan. I think Madam Anindita has written something there. She is not in dialysis. I think this is regarding the previous question.
Sir has already answered. So all the questions in the chat.
Okay, she got the answer. Okay.
Any further questions? So thank you so much for taking us through such an important chapter.
Sir, yeah, Gunjan, please continue. I will tell sir after that. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much, and I think everything. It's a very broad topic, like you mentioned before,
Yeah, it's very broad.
the disease itself. But you took liver cirrhosis in particular, and all the questions and queries from the audience has also been answered and well appreciated. Thank you so much. Nirmalata, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sir, thank you so much for your very insightful discussion. And sir, I have received two questions in my inbox, just very small and short question. And before asking that, I request all the participants that polling is open. Polling is open, please note. Polling is open. It is valid for 5 minutes. Give you valuable suggestion, valuable feedback on this polling. So please participate. We always believe the things are on a good note, and we tried our level best to do our program in such a good way that nobody has any complaint. But still, we always believe that there is always a improvement. So feel free to give your suggestion, your valuable inputs in the polling. Sir, I have received two questions. The first question is that what is the percentage of pancreatitis cases you are seeing in your daily practice?
Pancreatitis in daily practice, I think it's not related to this, but percentage
Okay, yeah.
pancreatitis in cirrhosis. I don't know if it's pancreatitis in cirrhosis. There are two things, two scenarios in which you'll have pancreatitis and cirrhosis. See, first is a disease which involves liver and pancreas both. So the most common scenario in which a dietitian or a gastroenterologist will see pancreatitis and liver cirrhosis both is ACLF related to alcohol, and that is where, see, it's very rare, and that is the only situations where we have seen pancreatitis along with cirrhosis. So alcohol caused the pancreatitis and alcohol has caused cirrhosis previously. Now the alcohol has caused ACLF to the patient. The patient lands in hospital and you see pancreatitis related to ACLF. And for other reasons, you can see cirrhotic patients who have low platelets and they've started on romiplastim and other drugs. These platelets, they can cause pancreatitis. So these are two situations in cirrhotic patients where you may see pancreatitis concomitant with liver cirrhosis.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. And the last question, what I received that if the patient is hemodynamically stable and he has come for admission to the hospital in the very critical stage, especially in the ICU. So many of the hospitals in Kolkata, they are following one protocol that irrespective of whether they are having any problem in digestion or not, they start the peptide diet. Okay, this is a protocol for many of the big hospitals following that, and then they shift to polymeric diet. So what is your opinion? Is it good, or we need to start polymeric first and then?
See, there are two things. First point is very clear that nutrition cannot stop for a cirrhotic patient. That's completely clear. Whether the patient is critically ill, whether the patient has come for with a beat, or the patient is normal. So nutrition cannot stop. The only choice for you is whether you want to go for a parenteral nutrition or a nasogastric nutrition. So if the patient is critically ill, even if the patient is ventilated, at least you can put in a nasogastric tube. So if you put in a nasogastric tube and start a peptide-based feed, I think that is ideal for the patient. I think patient should always go for that feed. If the patient, you cannot, kitchen feeds, you cannot maybe supplement food as much as calories. A peptide-based feed or a protein-based powder-based feed, they will have a very high concentration of proteins. So that will provide adequate calories to the patient and also the protein. So nasogastric feeding is correct. But if you start straight away TPN feeding, first you have to see. See, you start nasogastric feeding, then every 2 hours you G-aspirate the nasogastric tube to see how much is the remnant in the tummy, in the stomach. So if there is lot of remnant, if re-aspiration is lot, you can see that the patient is having gastroparesis, or the patient is in grade 2-3 encephalopathy, having vomiting, and there is a risk of aspiration, go for TPN. If the patient can tolerate NG feed, that is the most preferred and ideal enteral feeding to prevent infections, to prevent bacterial translocation. And if the patient is ventilated, the patient cannot aspirate, so nasogastric tube is the best feeding for this. And the type of feed then will be powder-based feed, which can be a peptide or whatever the feed, protein-based you can use if you want. If you can prepare a good kitchen feed, that's also good enough. Right.
Thank you very much, sir, for your have any question and in the chat box. And once again, so participants, you